Researchers agree that COVID-19 is unlikely to be the final pathogen that leads to a multi-country epidemic or a global pandemic. Whether the causes is climate change, biodiversity loss, globalization, or overpopulation, it has become vital to ensure that the world, and including national parks, learn from the past 3 years and implement these lessons learned into a contingency plan to ensure that we are ready for similar future events. A little bit of an inconvenient truth for so early in the morning. Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Madeline Huyser. I'm from the Northwest University. I work together with Prof van der Merwe on this specific project, which you might know better as the frogging guy. And then also Dr. Alicia Ali from the Sheffield Hallam University in the UK. And this project is all about contingency strategies for national parks. So we focused on COVID-19, but as I've now previously mentioned, it's likely that we are going to occur similar disaster events and we need to be ready. So the COVID-19 pandemic began to make its presence felt early January 2020 with some international cancellations. And this came on the back of a subdued domestic economy and market, and that already affected the visitation of national parks. So it has become clear that governments, instead of what we've now seen in a reactive response, need to be proactive to mitigate these type of impacts that can occur during crisis events. Now, what is meant by a contingency strategy or plan? A strategic contingency planning attempts to lessen the effects of less than favorable circumstances, which is a little bit of an understatement if you think about a pandemic, but the idea is to have a plan B, C, D, E even if necessary, to fall back on if things don't go as you've initially planned or thought it would go. Now, just to give a little bit of overview of this project, I'm only going to present a specific part, but this forms part of a bigger project in collaboration with the Peak District National Park and, as I've mentioned before, the Sheffield Hallam University, because we received funding from the British Council in the form of the Newton Fund, and this is stimulated the project. So this required for us to have a collaborator, and then we decided to do a comparative study between these two parks because it has it's very different in how it is managed, but there's a common human factor, the way that we respond to a crisis event, and it should also give a little bit of an interesting dynamic to see in terms of a developing country or a developed country, how you handle these type of situations. Now, we had a lot of challenges because we were on the red list, banned from almost everywhere in the world, and so I couldn't travel to go do the actual research. And then once the travel restrictions were lifted, they literally dropped their protocols in a few months. So before I could get there, they didn't have the protocols in place anymore. That was a big part of my measuring instrument. So we had to go back to the drawing board, reevaluate, get new ideas how to go forward in gathering the data. But we actually learned something that I think we can stop the presentation now because it's all about adapting. So you have to really make sure that you keep on top of things, and you have to just make sure you can adapt to a very rapidly changing environment. Okay, but this part will just then focus on the qualitative part that we did at the Kruger National Park. Hopefully next year I will be able to then come back and present the whole holistic outcome of the project. So our aims were to determine how satisfied tourists were with the protocols put in place in the Kruger National Park, to identify the current strategies that management were now employing to deal with these impacts, and then also to find out what we can learn and use in a future situation. Now, Levi Strauss said, "An expert knows all the answers if you ask the right questions." Now, that is what we attempted to do. We had a qualitative approach, non-probability, purposive sampling, and semi-structured interviews were used. So the questions centered around how they dealt with these changing protocols, the communication from the government, and what was good, what was bad, what was the lessons learned. So we targeted the managers, the camp managers specifically, kind of the foot soldiers that are on the ground dealing with all of these things on a day-to-day basis. So we wanted to get their input and hear what was the challenges, what did they feel can be improved upon, and so forth. But I'm not going to go into much depth with the methodology because I want to get to the juicy stuff, which is the results. Now, a lot of the things that we saw centered around uncertainty. A lot of the people or the staff members were uncertain about what's going on, and then they were kind of the people who had to reassure the visitors who were even more unsure of what's going on. And so communication was one of the things that they said is really, really an important thing to focus on. So that was some of the major impacts. Then there were the strategies that they already implemented, which is things like special prices for pensioners, as an example, to attract more local visitors, to get the numbers up again, to develop SOPs and protocols on different management levels, as well as different lockdown levels, because it changed as it goes along. And then there was time slots, for instance, as a very practical solution to social distancing, long queues. Visitors could actually apply for a time slot to go into the gates so that they can avoid waiting in long queues and having the social distancing and so forth. Challenges. So the communication between park management and visitors, and then really the changing and ambiguous information gazetted from the government. I think that was a very difficult thing to manage because people want answers from you, from management, and management waiting for those clarification from the government. So some future strategies that were now suggested, things like new concept ideas of planning, perhaps facilities with more private ablution pods so that people can have more privacy during their camping experiences, or to have a compliance committee, good communication networks, and we're going to touch up in a little bit more detail in the coming slides. And then it's always important to evaluate, re-evaluate, go back and see if we're still relevant, because it's so rapidly changing. And then there's the issue around marketing, or the market at the Kruger National Park, but national parks overall, and this is even a trend in the UK, is to focus on a domestic market, but also a very inclusive and a demographic that's a little bit more diversified. Especially an untapped black market in South Africa, which has a lot of potential, and just overall a more inclusive demographic. So this is some of the financial implications. The decline in visitor numbers has, as we've seen with the previous presentations, a really detrimental effect on the revenue of the parks. So a lot of the operational funding comes from our visitors, our tourists, and so obviously with less international visitors and domestic visitors, it became an issue. And then there were strategies to compensate for this financial issues, closing down of specific accommodation units, capital expenditures cut, no vacancies could be filled. There were some relief funds from the government, as I understand, but vastly too little. So, and then there was some other measures like online meetings, not traveling that much between camps and so forth. Visitor behavior was in the form of, it was actually just a representation of the broader society. You got your visitors that weren't compliant, and then there were your visitors that were complaining about the others who weren't compliant. And so you had to just make sure that you kind of handle these visitor behavior issues as they arise. And then very interesting is that there were little to no impact on satisfaction with the park itself, and people did not seem to mind the protocols all that much. And I think it has to do a lot with what I'm going to talk about later on, as well as the need to be outside and in nature, especially in crisis events. And this is something that makes national parks in a unique position, and it's kind of a marketing strategy, in my opinion, that can really be used to say, this is an open, natural space. It's good for your mental health, and mental health is associated with physical health. So definitely something that I think puts the national parks in a good position. Then Thank you. So this is just a nice figure to sum up what I've already said, and it boils down to this framework that we developed now. And this framework is obviously fluid, so it has to be adapted according to the crisis that you are in. Hopefully, I'm not a doomsday prophet saying that we should just worry all the time, but it's good to be prepared. Now, there's a disaster event, there's a local response and international response, and having a disaster committee that takes responsibility for disseminating information from the government to the rest of the park, through the visitors, and just putting everything together is a very good strategy. And then to revise all the time and make sure they're on top of things. And then establish SOPs from there, making sure there's good communication platforms. And then also these are some of the GRIN on the bottom, some of the specifics that I've mentioned already, some strategies that were put in place, like training of staff is definitely one important thing from a person that is a professional, that knows what's going on, that is applicable to the event that you are now managing. Okay, so to conclude, I just like that picture. I think it was taken recently in the Kruger National Park, which shows that even nature needs some time in nature. And I think it's a very important thing that we need to remember in times of crisis, is to be able to go into a natural space and to just relax, get away from the city, get away from other people, social distancing and so forth. But just to conclude, the forming of a disaster committee or COVID committee seems to be very effective, so that there's people taking responsibility for disseminating information, and it reassures the staff, and the staff are the people that reassures your guests, and it's a chain reaction. Visitors want to escape from the city, they want to come to these open, and they're very loyal. We see that a lot of the information that came through indicates that the park visitors are really, really loyal, and just to keep on providing good satisfactory experiences will actually, I think, just keep a steady influx of visitors. Okay, and just again, very important, public education awareness. One suggestion is, as I've mentioned before, to attract a more diverse demographic, but also using more tech-savvy communication platforms, because the youth of today doesn't even look at Facebook anymore that much. It's all about Instagram and TikTok and all these new platforms. So keeping up to date with what's the trends and disseminating information using those platforms, and even with specialized apps for a disaster event that gives push notifications through in real time as a protocol changes and so forth. And then there's some new concept designs, as we've mentioned before, maybe smarter buildings, more technology that replaces some of the human interaction. For instance, if you don't have to go to the reception to check in, and there's an online check-in option, that would actually also help to alleviate something social distance issues. And that's all from my side. I would just like to thank my colleagues and all the people that helped fund the project, and I look forward to giving the rest of the information next year. Thank you.